All right, fantastic. Can everyone see the slide? Hopefully we're up and running. All right, fantastic. Well, thanks again, everyone, for being here. It's great to see so many people here in the chat. I want to thank you for being here, especially on such short notice. Whether the stock market thing blows over or blows up, what I'll be teaching you tonight is going to be relevant either way. It's useful regardless of what scenario we're dealing with. Maybe it's Israel, Iran, it's the coming November elections and the fallout, the transfer of power, it's NATO, Russia, US, China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We really have an incredible gamut of challenges coming up pretty much for the rest of this decade. And, if we don't, we might not hit them all, but we're going to hit at least one of them. So I want to start off tonight just with a brief detour because I want to tell you a story about something that happened to us last weekend. As some of you know, I run a multi-county preparedness network, and I'll talk a lot more about that later. But in short, it's a group of preppers and homesteaders, concerned citizens, whatever they want to call themselves. But one major thing that we have in common is we all have families and we all have a lot of concern for the future. And so this past Saturday, we had our monthly meeting. And for 2 hours, normally we only go 1 hour. For 2 hours, everyone stayed there and we discussed national and strategic threats. So we're talking about big picture stuff like this Israeli-Iranian war, which may fizzle out to nothing. I don't know. Potential fallout over November elections, the transfer of power in January. Fingers crossed on that one. I don't know. War with China, the prospect of losing a world war. We talked about that for quite a while. And our purpose was not to war game this stuff. We weren't trying to figure out results. We're trying to figure out, how does this impact us locally? How does this impact us in our community? And it was really good. We got a lot of involvement. Everyone was engaged, talking about all of the follow-on effects of X happens, and then Y happens, and then Z happens. And we actually feel Z in our communities. And I'll tell you, that's the stuff we got to be preparing for. We can't get hung up around the axle on what's going on between the United States and China, because we really can't prepare for that. No one is preparing for hyperinflation or an EMP or the next pandemic. We're really preparing for the effects of those things. And if we're not preparing for the local effects, the local follow on, the trickle down, the second, third, fourth, fifth order effects of these big strategic problems, then I dare say that someone is not prepared if you're not preparing for those specific effects that happen at the local level. So if someone were to ask me what I'm preparing for, I really can boil it down here to one overarching thing. And that is, America as we know it has already kind of ended. The America we grew up in is no longer the America that we have, the United States. And I hate to be a doomer because I do see all these posts about turbo America, and the United States is just, it's going to come raging back any day now. We're on the verge of this national renaissance. And I hope those people are right, but I am very doubtful about those scenarios. And that's one thing I want to talk to you about tonight. The conclusion that I arrived at a long time ago was that my bug out bag in a closet of food and water is not going to cut it for the emergencies that we're about to get into this decade. Those things are going to help, but that is only sustainment. That is only going to get me into tomorrow. That was my big conclusion that I arrived at probably 5 or 6 years ago, that a bug out bag is just not going to cut it. Because really a bug out bag is a tactical solution. That's going to help you get into tomorrow, but it's not going to win the war, metaphorically speaking. So we need to be working on some strategic solutions because we're going to have some major strategic problems. And so the three things that I've been working on and have been teaching people about and encouraging everyone to work on as well are, number one, an area study. Number two, building a local intelligence network. And then number three, developing your real-time intelligence gathering capabilities, your collection capabilities, because we are going to need a lot of things in the future. And these three things are absolutely indispensable here. There's a very good chance that we are going to experience three major changes by the end of this decade. And it's impossible to tell what's going to happen 5 years from now. I'm feeling pretty good about these three things happening. One, there's a really good chance that we're going to see a world war by the end of the decade, and it is going to drastically alter our way of life. I was just looking into some numbers for another presentation I have to give on Thursday night. And almost 20% of everything we import comes from China. Just over 40% of all U.S. imports come from the Indo-Pacific region. Frankly, I'm not sure that there's enough maritime insurance in the world to keep those cargo ships in the water, those container ships up and running, and keep those goods flowing to the United States from these countries that are probably going to be embroiled in war. So at a minimum, there's going to be a severe strain on supply chains. And then almost another 20% of all of our imports come from European countries, which is probably going to be involved in this second front against Russia. And this is what these European NATO countries are saying. That's why they're passing these conscription and mandatory military service laws right now. So that's at least 60% of all U.S. imports that originate outside the Western Hemisphere. And that's a lot of stuff that's going to disappear from store shelves and not come back for a while, maybe. It's going to be far worse than the supply chain disruption that we saw in 2020 and into 21 and into 22. And it's going to last much longer. It's going to be highly inflationary. We're not going to be able to afford a lot of these things, even if we do get them here. So if you look at, especially, this is a big one, critical life-saving imports like pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, most of that stuff comes from China. So imagine a world where that stuff gets cut off to zero, that no more imports from China. So I go back to my three things: an area study, a local intelligence network, and real-time intelligence collection capabilities. Those things are going to help us out tremendously when we have to navigate these conditions, especially our area study, because that's going to help us to find alternative sources for the things that we need. A local intelligence network can alert us to a lot of things, like when a certain part gets restocked or where certain items are that we need and that we can obtain. That's the first thing. A world war is really going to be very disruptive to our way of life. The second thing here is that there's a good chance that we actually lose this world war. And this has empire-ending implications. And I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the work of Sir John Glubb. There's a book there on the left. It's called The Fate of Empires. He wrote it back in the 1970s. He was a British intelligence officer during World War II. And what he found was that empires on average last 250 years. And I'm not going to quibble on some of these dates, but I think that is a good rule of thumb. We can look at the work of Rain Tagapera, who's an Estonian political scientist who arrived. I did the math. He wrote a paper about this, and I did the math, and he found that empires last something like 2.65 centuries. So 265 years was really close to Glubb's 250 years. Ray Dalio has also written about this. He did a big study for a book called Principles for Navigating the Changing World Order. And I think it's a good rule of thumb. If you want to start that 250-year clock from 1776, we arrive 250 years later at 2026. I think a more accurate number is 1783. That's the end of the American Revolution. It's the Treaty of Paris, which unlocked Trans-Appalachia to U.S. expansion. That was in 1783. You add 250, we get 2033. Just by this one indicator, I never wanted to draw strong conclusions from a single indicator because, it's not like these empires have exact expiration dates, give or take a generation, probably in the ballpark. But we are living through this. And then there was another study that coincides about the same time frame that I want to talk about. If we do end up losing this world war, or maybe even if we achieve some kind of Pyrrhic victory, that's the end of the US dollar as the world reserve currency for a number of reasons, and we can talk about that later. But historically, currencies, and this is according to JP Morgan, currencies as the world reserve last for 80 to 100 years. So Bretton Woods back in 1944 established the US dollar as the world reserve. 1944 plus 80 is 2024. You had 100 years, you get 2044. So these two time frames are coinciding, which I think adds a little bit more credence to this whole argument. And so we're in this ballpark already. We're pretty darn close. So my question is, how do we navigate a national crisis when or if the dollar is in free fall? How do we navigate what's probably hyperinflation in this scenario and all the political and social and economic follow-on effects at the local level? Because that's the stuff that we need to plan for. That's the stuff that we can deal with. So I go back to my three things. And I say an area study, a local intelligence network, and real-time intelligence collection capabilities. Those things are going to help us out tremendously when we have to navigate these conditions. And then finally, if we do fight and lose a third world war and we lose the dollar as the world reserve, then the American collapse, the collapse of the American empire goes right along with it. And my guess is that this results in some kind of political restructuring of the United States. And I think this is one of the few ways that we actually get a national divorce, even though it may be very painful, may actually get a proper revolution here. This chart is from Ray Dalio, his great book called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. I don't care for his politics, but the stuff that he writes about in this book is quite good. And this is the cycle that he sees for world orders. You start off with prosperity, you hit this big debt bubble, you have this big wealth gap, which we do have, and then you have a debt bust. And he studied dozens of world orders and empires. And then after this debt bust, you get this really calamitous cascade of events. You get money printing and credit. So I seriously doubt the worst of our money printing has happened. You know, we talk about $34 trillion in national debt, and then another 170, 190, $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. There's no way we're going to cut that out of our budgets. You can't tax that out of the system. You're going to have to print a lot of money. And so that is coming. And then according to Ray Dalio's study of history, then you get revolutions and wars, you get debt restructuring, you get political restructuring, and then finally you have this new world order, which in his case, he believes is China. And you read about the history of these collapses, whether it's political collapse or social or economic collapse, and they're just brutal. I mean, lawlessness, raping and pillaging, street violence, famine and starvation, just really brutal conditions in some of these worst case scenarios. And you look at like balkanization and stuff like Yugoslavia, horrific. And so I look at my town and I wonder how we're going to cope with these things. What is that going to do to race relations? I live in an area, you know, my town is pretty diverse, the broader area, because I live in Central Texas, and we do have a lot of Hispanics here. And then in the city, we do have a lot of blacks, and then everyone else is white. What is that going to do to the urban-rural divide? And who among these people that surround me are going to pose a real threat, whether that's through organized crime or ad hoc gang warfare, when social cohesion evaporates? Because that is probably one of the most key lessons from history, is that cultural uniformity is the basis for social cohesion. And when cultural uniformity degrades, you get social disintegration in a literal sense. Society becomes disintegrated from each other. And then we get stuff like civil wars and low intensity conflicts and tribalized warfare, which we already have in the United States. And so these are just the potential conditions that really concern me. So I go back to my three things: an area study, a local intelligence network, and then real-time intelligence collection capabilities. And those are the things that I really want to have up and running when I'm forced to navigate these conditions. And so that sets the stage for the rest of my presentation tonight. As always, please do post your questions into the chat. If I can answer those right away, I will. Otherwise, we'll save them for the Q&A portions. And I think Q&A probably is the best part of this. I really enjoy that. So if you do have any questions, be as specific or as general as you want. You've got me for the rest of the evening, and I'm here to help. I do just want to run through a couple of quick slides here. This is from, I think it's a 2018 National Defense Strategy. The Joint Force, meaning the Joint Military Force, can no longer assume the homeland is a sanctuary. This is our military admitting this several years ago. Yeah, back in December 2020, the Army published a facility security report, and they wrote that Adversaries will subject the continental U.S. to anti-access efforts by conventional and unconventional means, including but not limited to cyber attacks, fomenting protests, and criminal activity. Really, they're talking about transnational criminal activity here. And then they continue, they'll use sophisticated ISR networks to target military installations and soft targets associated with friendly forces, including private sector organizations, civilian infrastructure, institutional Army and joint targets, space capabilities, and service members' families. And again, this is not prepperdoom.com. This is the Army admitting this stuff. And I think it is reasonable to expect that exactly this is going to happen. So my big promise tonight is that if you stick around to the end, you're going to walk away with some knowledge, some action steps. Some of you, this is going to radically change how you think about preparedness. And you are going to be able to take action on these things starting tonight to improve your situation in the near future. Now, I do advise you to take notes. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about where you can download a PDF of notes that I've already taken for you, and I will share that link with you as well. Now, finally, why should anyone listen to me? And just briefly, I'm a former intelligence NCO. That's non-commissioned officer. I got out as a Sergeant E5 after having spent about 40 months deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan as a soldier and then as a contractor. And today I teach intelligence courses across the country to people a lot like you. Our training company is called Gray Zone Activity. I also run Early Warning Network, which is a subscription-based intelligence service. And I've also been in the preparedness movement since 2008 or so. And gosh, we're just used to hearing the same things over and over and over. You need a bug out bag, and you need at least a dozen different rifles and so many rounds of ammunition. And you need at least a year's worth of freeze-dried food and a little vault of survival seeds. And you need night vision and thermal. And you need your little survival Slurpee straw and a lensatic compass and at least 2 fire starters. And if you don't have 70 pounds of crap in your bug out bag, then you're not going to make it. I call these people the bug out bag industrial complex. I own all these things. They will come in handy. I'm not saying you don't need any of this stuff, but that bug out bag and that basement full of stuff at best is just going to get you into tomorrow. It's not going to win the war. And I'm interested, highly interested in winning the war. And so we need something else to get us there. So if you will, just imagine a few things with me. In your hands, you have a binder that contains every conceivable and realistic emergency scenario that you might face locally. It contains a list of specific threats and hazards, along with recommendations on how to mitigate those risks and some actions that you can take to respond in those scenarios. And you've taken this list of scenarios and you've started to prepare for the most likely and the most dangerous. And everything you buy or acquire from this point on, everything from what you buy to how you spend your time, what skills you develop, those are all things that are directed by what you will need for these scenarios or to cover up your own vulnerabilities to these threats and hazards. So you're not wasting time, you're not wasting money, you're not chasing unnecessary gear that you're never going to use. You're not planning for unrealistic scenarios. You're living in the real world with accurate expectations of the future, and you're not living in a prepper fantasy, and I go to a lot of prepper events, and there's a lot of people living out their prepper fantasies there. I'm not going to burst their bubble, but I hope they do it before the real world does. And so not only are you an expert in your area's future threat scenarios, but you also have a list of assets, resources, and opportunities. And these are people and facilities. It's local natural resources, business or employment opportunities, financial and economic opportunities, ways for you to make extra money, and things that will benefit your situation if you choose to act on this intelligence. So you meet key people who work at key places or who have access to key information and key materials. And so we do that so that you can get what you need ahead of these emergencies that you're preparing for. What I've just described to you is an area study. And we do an area study for 2 reasons. Number one, first, to identify what we're up against. So threats, hazards, and vulnerabilities. And second, to identify what we have to work with. What resources, assets, and opportunities. Who are the people and things and places that I have in my local area that I can marshal? Who are the people that I need to organize? Where are the places or where are the facilities that can benefit us? What resources do I have to make our lives easier or to improve our lives during some emergency scenario? When I first started my area study, I did not know pretty much a single thing about the area, because this is the first real area study that I did here in the States. And it was a really good opportunity for me to start from literally nothing but my home address. And so how I approached my area study is also how I recommend you approach your area study. So just pretend for a second that there's some special forces team, some ODA out there that's going to parachute into your backyard during an emergency and start solving problems. So what do these guys need to know? If they're going to get to work, start training up the locals, taking out the bad guys, solving local problems, what information is going to help them do their jobs effectively? Now let's stop pretending for a second, because the only special forces team that's coming to rescue you is really, there's not one, but the only team that's coming to rescue you is you and your friends and the local assets that you meet and train with. And you are that team for your area. That is how I look at an area study. You are the team for your area. So what do you need to know in order to carry out the mission? And you might be saying, well, Mike, I'm not special forces, and I never was. And guess what? Neither was I. But that is exactly how we should be looking at developing your local area. How do we develop the local political, social, and economic power required to keep the good stuff up and running and the bad stuff out, especially during a national emergency? How can we take that mission profile of identifying like-minded people locally and training them up so that we can solve local problems? How can we assess our needs, ensure that we have access to clean water and medical care? How can we keep local communications up and running? How can we facilitate local trade and commerce, like running a farmer's market? How can we support local law enforcement if they deserve our support? How can we build local political power to make sure that the people making the rules that we're supposed to live under are not acting against us or not acting outside of our interests? That's what politics is all about. How can we build the social power required to enforce social norms and make sure that our people are getting behind local causes that are going to improve our lives and not threaten them? How can we build economic power? So how can we employ our people or our tribe? How can we make sure that they have some kind of work, even in a Great Depression or a collapse scenario? How can we take care of our tribe? The work that we do in an area study is going to answer those questions and a whole lot more. There's a really bad misconception about an area study that it's just a collection of information. And people say, I don't need an area study. I've lived here for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and I know this area like the back of my hand. I hear that from people, especially online. And that is a really bad way to think about an area study. An area study is a blueprint for action. That bug out bag is going to get you into tomorrow. But all the things that I just talked about, that's what's going to win the war, metaphorically speaking. That is how we are going to maintain some semblance of a first world zone in a third world descent, or what may end up being a third world free fall. That's how you win low intensity conflict at the local level against gangs and violent social movements. And then we can take the success that we build in our community, and maybe it's just in your neighborhood, but we can start exporting the strategy and these tactics out to surrounding areas. And that is how you reconquer or refound your country, especially during a collapse. So an area study is not a boring collection of an area's information. It really is the foundation for all preparedness planning and security operations. Remember, in the Army, we said intelligence drives the fight. Actionable intelligence is the driving factor for all forms of warfare, including political, social, and economic warfare. And that is where we need to excel at the local level. You've all seen that video probably from Yuri Bezmenov. And he talks about this. This was back in probably the 70s or 80s. And he talks about the concept of sabotage. And he said, you go watch the Hollywood movies in America, and you think of sabotage, and the Russians are going to send people over here to blow up the bridge. And, he says, really, most of the Soviet intelligence money is actually being funneled to psychological sabotage, psychological warfare, nonviolent forms of warfare, so stuff that we don't typically, as Americans, we don't consider warfare. Remember the big divide between the left and the right in this country, and the big divide between the United States and, say, a country like China, is how we view violence. For us on the right, and really us in the Western world, violence is a switch. War is a switch. It's either off or it's on. To left-wing revolutionaries in this country, to China, violence is a dial. It can be turned up. It can be turned down, depending on the situation. We need to get really good at controlling the dial, which means nonviolent forms of warfare. So political, social, and economic tools. We need to be developing that power at the local level, because that's where the fight is. And when we cede that fight to someone else, that we're taking tools out of our hands that we could be using. And I hate to see that happen, but that is happening all around the country. Yeah, Dan says low intensity conflict is what we're facing now. Guys, this is what I'm giving you right now. This is the roadmap to winning low intensity conflict. So what we have to do first is become experts at our local operational environment. And in just a second, I'm going to share with you the 6 layers of our operational environment. And this is what really forms the core part of our area study. When we go through these 6 layers, I'm really thinking 3 things. I'm thinking, number 1, does this have a positive benefit on me, or what are the positive effects on me? Number 2, what are the negative effects on me, or does this negatively affect me? And then number 3, is this neutral? Is this a neutral factor that I can turn into an asset or turn into a positive factor? Or is this a neutral factor that I need to consider that maybe it could be turned into a negative? Someone else could use this neutral factor and turn it negative for me. And those 6 layers are physical terrain and weather. So mountains, hills, valleys, weather conditions, they're going to affect you. They're going to affect your operations. Next is the human terrain. So it's not just demographics, race and ethnicity and all that stuff, population density. It's the beliefs. It's the culture. It's the people and what they think and what they believe about government, what they believe about law enforcement, what they believe about you. Next is critical infrastructure. That's all the stuff that keeps our world running. After that, we have politics and governance. These are the people that make rules that they want you to live under. Next is safety, security, and defense, which is just another way of saying law enforcement, military, and local security. These are the people who are going to be enforcing the rules that politicians make. Very important part of our operational environment. And then finally, we have economics and finance. So what are the economic drivers of your area? And what are the economic considerations going into an emergency? Listen, I've written an entire book about this. It's called the Area Intelligence Handbook. I've also made some videos and I actually have an entire online course about this. So I'm not going to rehash all that here, but the thing that I send you via email will have a bunch of notes and stuff in there for you as well. If you have any questions about doing an area study, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to keep moving on here. We're shooting at right about an hour, I think. So we got maybe 30 more minutes before we get to Q&A. All right. The second thing that I want to talk about, the first is area studies. The second thing is having a functioning local intelligence network, or if you want to call it an information sharing network. I find that's less jarring for some people until they get used to the idea. I told this one lady that we have an intelligence network, and she was very concerned. She thought she just got this puzzled look on her face. And I said, well, think of it like just an information sharing network. We're just sharing local information, like local news, local emergency events. And she's like, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Listen, I don't care what you call it. As long as you have one, you need one. So let's talk briefly about the philosophy behind a local intelligence network, because we, as in you and I, we're always going to be limited in the amount of information that we can gather as one person at one time. So if you're the only one doing collection, then you're never going to be able to do it fast enough or long enough to get what you need by the time that you need it. And so really what we need is more sensors. We need more people out there. In the Army, we said every soldier is a sensor. So every soldier has an obligation to see something and say something, or to pass up information that might be of intelligence value. And so if those soldiers' mission was to patrol the village by their FOB, their forward operating base, let's say in Afghanistan, but only one soldier could observe and report information, that would not be a very effective way to do that. And our neighborhoods really are the same way. If my mission is to patrol my neighborhood in a collapse scenario, which may not be entirely likely, but some kind of severe disruption, I can only be in one place at one time. And so my ability to collect information is very limited. It's limited to my line of sight. But if I have all my neighbors on board and they're feeding information back to the TOC, or they're feeding information back to our little neighborhood headquarters we have set up, then we're going to get a much better sense of what's going on in the community. And with enough sensors, we're going to get a really good picture of the current security situation. And back in 2015, we battle tracked the Ferguson riots. And this is exactly what we did. We tracked the rioters on a map on Google Earth. We were dropping pins, moving pins, taking snapshots, updating people on what was going on. And at any given time, I could tell you exactly where the rioters were. And I could tell you where there are no rioters, because we had sensors. We had lots of information coming in. And so that's just one example of doing that. And we've done that many times before. And if Trump gets elected and the inauguration pops off like it did J20 back in 2016, we will probably be battle tracking the inauguration as well. It's just a really good it's a real world training exercise, but people get used to the battle rhythm. They get used to taking in information, plotting it on a map, making sense of what's going on, and then producing intelligence. It's a fun time. So at any rate, if you're like us, if you're like me, we are still under what I consider blue skies, which means maybe there's a storm coming, but we're still in preparation mode. We're not yet in responding mode. And my local network, we still share important information. We have a signal chat, and people are always dropping information there. Sometimes it's national news. Oftentimes it's local news, stuff that's happening locally. Sometimes it's stuff at a yard sale, like, hey, here's a picture of some ham radio equipment. Does anyone need this? A couple of times it's been the chuck roast that's on sale at the local grocery store. But the point of all this is I've gathered these people and I've pointed them in the same direction. And once something does kick off, these people are already used to sharing information. So they can report stuff to the group or directly to me. Everyone can stay situationally aware of what's happening beyond their own line of sight. And if it's not through a cell phone, then it's going to be through other forms of communication, like ham radio, which is another indispensable tool and skill. And so if you were just getting started, or let's say you have a small group of friends, you want to expand your nodes or expand the number of sensors that you have out in that area, I recommend two ways of doing this. The first is by starting a neighborhood watch. This is going to be a really great way to get started for some people. For others, it's going to be a non-starter. I've had people tell me straight up, Mike, there's no way I can start a neighborhood watch. That's not going to fly in my hood. I get that. But for those of you who can, there are a bunch of resources. National Neighborhood Watch is one that is run through the National Sheriff's Association. That is a really great place to start. And maybe we can do a separate webinar on this topic as well. Hey, actually, if you're interested in starting a neighborhood watch, or at least starting an intelligence network, go ahead and raise your hand or just say yes in the chat if that's something that interests you. Maybe we can do another webinar on this topic. I'd like to do a lot more webinars. And then the second way that we can build a local intelligence network is by starting a county preparedness network, which is what I've done from my area. We have multiple counties involved, and we hold monthly meetings, and they're open to the public. So we start off each meeting. I talk about local security issues. People share their concerns. I talk about the concerns that I have, because I'm the S2, and I talk about big picture stuff, and we try to figure out how that's going to trickle down and affect our community, or how we are going to be vulnerable to these conditions or events. Like hurricanes is a really good example. Hurricanes on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And that gives us something to prepare for. And then after that, we usually offer some sort of free training, and then we go and help anyone with ongoing projects. We've gone to another guy's house and built a chicken coop. We've butchered chickens. We built a greenhouse. Just whoever needs something done, we can go help them out. It's a really good team building exercise as well. We've also done a group backpacking trip. So on the topic of training, right, I'm trying to get people into this meeting for several reasons. But one way I get them to the meeting is through free training, because people invite their friends or they invite family members or whatever. We've had one of our medics talk about cold weather injuries one winter. We've had a sheriff's deputy talk about active shooter considerations, so what to do and what not to do during an active shooter event, and a bunch of basic stuff like prepper stuff like emergency communications. And we've developed an emergency communications plan or an area comms plan. We talked about generators, talked about long-term food storage, lots of other topics. And I started this preparedness network for a couple of reasons. First is because I know that people are going to bring me information. Once they kind of get read on to our program, so to speak, once they come and they learn and they start to understand why we have a preparedness network, I don't have to go chase those people down and beg, borrow, and steal information from them. They join the network, and then they willingly share information with everybody or directly with me because they know it's in their best interest. The more the group knows, the better we can anticipate future events, the better we can respond to emergencies, and everyone gets that. And it's been really incredible to see the amount of cooperation that happens. It's community building. And I saw a lot of people in the chat also talk about the importance of community and tribe. And community and tribe, that's one of those strategic assets that's going to help you win the war at the local level, not just make it into another day. And the second reason I started this, it started off as a county preparedness network. Now we've expanded to multiple counties. But the second reason is because these meetings act like a magnet for like-minded people. So members have brought their friends and family members. People have come for the free training events. And it's been a really great way for us to meet new people from the community who are like-minded. We've met several veterans this way as well. Veterans who have real skills and experience downrange as well. And then once they work their way into the network and they show up, and they're much more willing also to answer questions, specific questions that I have, like questions about or answers I'm looking for my own collection requirements, which is just a fancy way of saying the pieces of information that I want or need. So this is a neighborhood watch and a county or regional preparedness network. They're I would say, the two fastest ways for you to build your local intelligence network. If you're interested in setting up your own preparedness network and holding your own county preparedness meetings, I can teach you exactly how I've built mine, and I would also be happy to do that. Again, I think we've already done this, but if you are interested in that, definitely do let me know, because I do want to provide more online teaching for things that I'm working on locally, because it's stuff that I know that works and it's making a difference for me. I really cannot tell you how beneficial it has been to have a group of guys. And a lot of those dudes are veterans who have real skills. And not only do they have skills, but they show up and they put in work and they have time, they dedicate time, and they have the willingness to put towards these community projects, because they know that they're also helping themselves when we help others. All right. And thanks everyone who piped in for all that. I think this is a really good line of effort for this fall, especially as people get settled back into routines. It's not too late to start an August meeting. Call up your friends, hold a county preparedness meeting. I'm telling you this, it has been absolutely fantastic for me. All right. And then the last key here. So we talked about area studies. We talked about intelligence networks. Now we're going to move on to collection capabilities. So if you have a real-time emergency and you need to make real-time decisions, then you're going to need some real-time information coming in. And so there are 4 primary disciplines here that we have to develop. There are other intelligence disciplines that we will not cover tonight, but these are the 4 primary disciplines that I highly recommend you develop before going into an emergency or before any situation where your decisions are dependent on real-time information. If you have a time-sensitive decision or time-sensitive scenario or event, we're not going to have time to say, oh, let me spend 15 minutes Googling this. We need it now. We got to make this decision now. And by the way, listen, I know this is a lot of information for some people, and it is a lot of work. I just saw a comment earlier talking about it sounds like a lot of work, and it is. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that it's quick and easy, because it's not. Realistically, one person can take the Area Intelligence Workshop, which is the online version of all this, and knock out a solid area study on a Saturday. Sit down 8-10 hours, depending on where you live, and you'll walk away with a pretty darn good area study. I always say intelligence is a team sport. Intelligence gets a lot easier the more people that you have. And so, some you can knock out with 3 or 4 people on a Saturday morning, or at least get a really good skeleton of one as well. And then you can go and fill that in. But listen, realistically, to build an intelligence network up to initial operating capacity, to build a network that you will really need, if you know a lot of people, it's probably still going to take you 3 to 6 months just to build that basic intel network. And that's because your time is actually not the bottleneck here. It's everyone else's time and effort that's the bottleneck. And that the time that they will spend to you, the time they'll give to you, or how on board they will be, really depends on how motivated they are to be active in it. If you are starting from scratch in an area where you don't already know people, you're looking at a solid 18 months to build the intelligence network that you need. And that's just for the average person. You may be able to do it a lot faster if you're highly motivated. But otherwise, your network is going to be at the mercy of your ability to build relationships with other people. And that's not all on you. Some of that's going to be on them. And that's one reason why it takes so long. And let me also say this. That's because a solid intelligence network it's really not just a bunch of friends and family that you dump into a Signal chat. I mean, that's good. Like, that's better than nothing. But when I talk about an intelligence network, I'm talking about specifically going out and finding the people who have placement and access to the information that I need for early warning and actionable intelligence. And most or all of that is going to come from people who work in local politics or local government, local law enforcement, local emergency services, local utilities. Those are the kinds of people that you really want as sources. I'm talking about source recruitment cycle. Spotting and assessing, especially at the very front of that. Super important. We go out and find the person that you want, or the type of person that you want. And so these are the kinds of people that you really want as sources, and that takes time to build. That's also another training course. But it sounds like an intelligence networking course is something that you'd be interested in, or maybe we can do another webinar on this, and I'll work on that. I have definitely some work cut out for me. All right, let's get back to developing your intelligence collection capability. So there's 4 primary disciplines, and I'll start with my favorite, which is human intelligence. These are human sources who have placement and access to the information that I want. So we just talked about an intelligence network, but we can also be collecting other ways. And one of those ways is just starting with interviews and debriefs. That is the least intrusive, because those people are willingly providing us information. And you can do that by doing something as simple as going on a ride-along with local police. A lot of local police departments have these ride-along programs. In most cases, I do not recommend going on a Tuesday afternoon. Go on a Friday or Saturday night. Pick the night shift when all the zoo creatures are coming out, and you really get to see what your town looks like. Go with the guy or the gal who's normally out cruising alone, And I'll tell you, every time I've done this on a night shift, the police officer I've been with has been very talkative. And just remember, you are a concerned citizen. Just be interested in their job and what they experience. Be genuinely interested what they experience on a night to night basis. I would not pry too much, but we talk about elicitation techniques and other forms of, like questioning types to keep that conversation going. But I tell you, I've not had any problems with people sharing information with me, law enforcement officers sharing information on these ride-alongs. Also, some cities have citizens police academies, which I also highly recommend. My own city had one that I went through a couple of years ago. It was one night a week for 8 weeks. I learned all about local police operations and the justice system, met a lot of great contacts in local law enforcement and emergency services as well. And if you do that, definitely follow up with those people. And I'll just tell you a story real quick. The first cop that I met, I actually met him because he was a subscriber at Fort Observer. And I asked him 2 questions one day. Number one, what other cops are into preparedness? And then number 2, what other cops like to hunt and fish? Because I want to go hunting and fishing with those dudes. And he ended up taking me to this guy's homestead out in the middle of nowhere, BFE, Texas. And he was another cop, and we went fishing in his bass pond. And I've got to know him really well, and now he's a member of our preparedness network. So find those opportunities to network and meet other folks. And remember, ABEYN, always be expanding your network. There's a lot more stuff on HUMINT we can talk about. I do teach a 3-day course on this, but we've got to move on to open source intelligence here. So this is information that primarily comes from the internet, although any public or unprotected source is considered OSINT. Like social media is probably like the most popular open source information source. But that also includes things like newspapers and websites, media and news sources. Public meetings are also open source. So you can go to your city hall meeting or your county commission meeting or whatever you have, and you should be going to those because they are great places to pick up local intelligence information. Several years ago, a buddy of mine in North Carolina not only started going to the city hall meetings, but he started videotaping it because what he found is that the stuff they talked about in those city hall meetings, some of that information did not make it into the minutes that was posted on the city hall's website or the city government's website. So he would just get the minutes and read the minutes and see what they talked about. And he started going and he realized, hey, they are selectively editing some stuff out. Another thing that I highly recommend you do is make a list of local news stations and then find the reporters who work at those news stations and then find the social media accounts of those people. Because all of our local reporters, maybe not all, but a lot of them do actually live tweet whatever they're working on, especially if they're reporting on scene. And every time we've battle tracked a scenario, like battle tracked the Ferguson riots, battle tracked J20, battle tracked the Republican National Convention in 2016, doing all these things, this has been a fantastic source of information, open source information, finding not only the kind of gonzo journalists who are, out in the mix of the rioters and stuff, which has been helpful, but finding the reporters who are taking videos and taking pictures and posting their firsthand accounts of the things that they're seeing. Because some of the stuff that they tweet about does not make it into the news cycle. So I'll say don't overlook social media because it is extremely valuable. Next up is signals intelligence. We are surrounded by radio frequencies. The first time I got out a wideband receiver, I just started fiddling around with it. I was amazed. And this was, 5-10 years ago. I was amazed at all the signals that I could put up. There's people there talking and broadcasting. And all I started doing was just tuning through the bands. And once I found someone that was broadcasting, I would wait and I'd write down the frequency and try to write down anything that I heard, like a radio log. And it was very helpful. Now, the number one tool that you will probably be interested in is a police scanner. Some of these police scanners can get quite expensive pretty fast. But one thing you can do is go to radioreference.com. That is a fantastic website. Radioreference.com. You can use a search feature so you can put in your county or your zip code, and it's going to give you all of the emergency services frequencies for your area. Now, a couple of things. A lot of areas are moving to encrypted transmissions. And so unless you can somehow get one of their radios, like maybe if you become a volunteer police officer, you're pretty much just SOL if they are encrypted. There's some metadata that we can pull out of those transmissions, but otherwise we're just not going to be able to get access to them. So that's the first thing I would, before I went out and bought a $500 scanner, I have several of them, look at my locals, my city police, they're all encrypted. Most cities in Texas are now encrypted, which is tough. Otherwise, there's a lot of other things. We can listen into ham bands and listen into the local yokels talk about whatever they're talking about. There's lots of stuff. Just for the sake of time, we'll move on. But the bottom line is, during an emergency, I'm going to do a couple things. Number one, I want to have previously identified the popular ham bands, not only the popular ham frequencies, not only the frequencies, but also the time where they hold local nets or the times where they jump on and start talking. The big benefit of scanning through those and writing all those down is that if there is an emergency, I'm going to be able to tune directly to this frequency because I know that guy's over there talking about something. All right, and then finally is imagery intelligence. And this is stuff like drones, full motion video, videos like live feeds, photographs, all that stuff can be imagery intelligence. There's a couple of things here. There's a thing called GeoInt or geospatial intelligence. I really hate that it's on discipline. I'll just kind of include this in, I think IMIT and GeoInt really go hand to hand, but maps are a fantastic product for geospatial intelligence. You need 3 different kinds of maps. Number one is imagery map. So the most recent overhead imagery you can get for your area. Number 2 is a street map. And number 3 is topographic map. And then once I have those 3 maps, I also want to get every potential cross section I have. So if my local Chamber of Commerce has a map, I want to get that. If I can get an old Forest Service road map, a tourist map, a map of mines, pipelines, whatever I can get my hands on, because the more data we have, more data on GIS systems and like ArcGIS, and the more data I can pull from maps, the much better area study I'll be able to produce. As always, put your questions into the chat. We do have a lot of questions and I will catch up. But first, I want to tell you about this online course called the Area Intelligence Workshop. Listen, if anything in tonight's presentation interests you and you want to learn more, if you want to produce better intelligence for your local area, and remember, the better intelligence we produce, the better our plans can be. If you want to improve your preparedness plans or make some considerations about what you might do in an emergency, if you want to go produce some actual contingency plans, if you need bug out from a big city and get back home, especially, you have to do an area study. You are not going to make it if you do not do an area study. If you want to avoid wasting a lot of time and hassles and avoid getting hung up, then take me up on tonight's offer. The Area Intelligence Workshop is the online version of this course. I go from A to Z, step by step, how to build an area study. This is the same exact process that I use for private clients, corporations, high net worth individuals. Also, we do work for humanitarian aid groups like the Cajun Navy. We do an area study before they deploy and go into these flooded areas. I'm teaching you the exact same curriculum that I lead those guys through. You can start tonight. That also comes with my 30-day money back guarantee. If this course does not help you, it will. And I'm convinced that it will. But if this course doesn't help you, if it doesn't evolve the way you think about disaster preparedness, if it doesn't help you improve your disaster response plans, then I'll give you your money back. And as a part of this, I'm going to send you a copy of my book. I'm going to send you a box of training materials. If you don't like the training, if it's not for you, I don't want you to be stuck with it. And it's really as simple as that. So just shoot me an email and I'll refund your money if it's not for you. Yep, he says the workshop is well worth the money. Well, I appreciate that. So if you would like to sign up for the Area Intelligence Workshop, I'd love to have you as a student. I'll also be doing some student-only webinars. We're going to go a little bit deeper into some of the topics we talked about tonight. You can get started at areaintelligence.com. And let's start developing local intelligence so we can keep our families safe and our homes secure and neighborhoods secure during this next national emergency. Well, like I said, the next 10 years, we've got a lot of stuff going on.